Okay, so stay with me on this one, because this is a story that starts with a signature on a memo you probably didn't hear about. And it ends with something that structurally upends about 80 years of how the United States has thought about who gets to build its warships. And the 7 days part isn't a marketing hook. It's genuinely how fast this moved once the last piece clicked into place, even though, as you're about to see, the pieces before it took the better part of a year to line up. So here's where we start. On August 13, 2026, Donald Trump signed something called a National Security Presidential Memorandum. Now I know, the second you hear presidential memorandum, your eyes want to glaze over. I get it. It sounds like the single most boring possible category of government paperwork imaginable. But presidential memoranda are how a huge amount of actual policy gets made in this country, quietly, without a floor vote, without a press conference most people watch. And this one did something that, as far as the reporting shows, the United States has essentially never done before in the modern shipbuilding era. It said, foreign shipbuilders that are actively investing in American shipyards can now build up to 2 vessels for the U.S. Navy in their own country, back home on their own soil, and export them here. Not components, not maintenance contracts, not repair work in a dry dock somewhere. Ships fully built overseas for the United States Navy. And within about 48 hours, foreign media, specifically outlets covering Korean industry closely, had connected the obvious dot. This is enormously good news for South Korea, and specifically for one company in particular, Hanwha, which had already been quietly, methodically positioning itself for exactly this moment for the better. Part of a year before the ink was even dry. So let's back up, because the 7 days framing in this title isn't really about 7 days existing in isolation, some sudden decision made on a Tuesday afternoon. It's about the fact that this memo is the final domino in a chain that's been getting built, piece by piece, deliberately, since last October, and most people watching the news cycle scroll by have probably caught maybe 1 or 2 of those individual pieces in isolation, without ever seeing the full structure connecting them. Here's what's actually verified, and I'm going to walk through this slowly, methodically, because the sequence itself matters here more than any single fact plucked out of it in isolation. Go back to October 2025. Trump and South Korean President Lee Jae-myung sit down for a bilateral meeting, and out of that meeting comes a trade agreement, $350 billion, South Korea investing in the United States, $150 billion of that specific figure earmarked directly for rebuilding American shipbuilding capacity, not South Korean shipbuilding, American shipbuilding specifically, and as part of that same announcement. On the very same day, Trump does something that, if you know anything about how jealously the United States has historically, almost religiously, guarded nuclear propulsion technology, should have made you sit up straight in your chair. He says South Korea can build a nuclear-powered submarine in Philadelphia using shared American nuclear submarine technology. Now, for context, so you understand exactly how unusual this is, the United States has exactly one other nuclear submarine technology sharing arrangement anywhere in the entire world. It's called AUKUS, the partnership with the United Kingdom and Australia. And even in that arrangement, even with 2 of America's oldest, closest, most trusted allies on the planet, the U.S. did not directly hand over the actual underlying nuclear propulsion know-how itself. This was different. This went further. So where specifically is this submarine actually supposed to get built? Hanwha Philly Shipyard, which, and this is worth sitting with as its own footnote, is not some brand new facility Hanwha built from scratch to court American favor. It's a shipyard South Korea's Hanwha Group bought outright in 2024 for $100 million, purchased from a Norwegian investment group that used to own it. $100 million for a facility that is now, less than 2 years later, being positioned publicly as ground zero for one of the most significant technology sharing arrangements in modern naval history. That's not a coincidence of timing. That's a company that saw exactly where this was heading well before the rest of us did. December 2025. Hanwha's global chief strategy officer, a man named Alex Wong, stands up at a media day event held right at the Philly shipyard itself and says, on the record, plainly, that the shipyard has the actual technical capability of building a nuclear-powered submarine for the U.S. Navy, and that Hanwha is, in his own words, ready to fulfill that ability the moment the 2 governments are ready to move forward. That's not a rumor circulating in defense industry trade publications. That's the company itself, standing in front of reporters, telling the world directly, we are positioned, we are staffed, and we are waiting for the green light. June 2026. Trump, at a press conference, says the Navy will work with Hanwha specifically on a new class of frigates and floats language about an entire future fleet concept he's taken to calling the Golden Fleet. He doesn't specify in that particular appearance whether Hanwha gets any role in the more sensitive Virginia class submarine programs specifically, but the frigate comment alone is a real concrete on the record commitment from the sitting President of the United States, not a hypothetical, not a maybe. July 2026. And this, I think, is genuinely the most interesting beat in the entire sequence, because this is where you can actually watch the system testing the water carefully before committing to the big jump. The U.S. Navy puts out what's called a request for information, an RFI addressed specifically to South Korean shipbuilders. Now, an RFI, if you're not familiar with the term, is not a contract. It's not even remotely close to being a contract. It is the Navy, formally on paper, asking a question. Hypothetically, if we wanted you to build things for us, what exactly could you do and how fast? And crucially, multiple reports at the time were careful to note that even if the answer that came back was we could build you quite a lot, it wouldn't actually matter in practice because there are real laws already on the books, actual federal statute, restricting foreign construction of United States naval vessels. Congress would have to act to change that. That's the wall standing between an industry capability and an actual purchase order. That's the thing separating South Korea has an impressively large and efficient shipbuilding industry from South Korea is now building ships for the United States Navy. And then, August 13th, Trump signs the memorandum, and notice what the memorandum does not do. It doesn't wait around for Congress to pass some sweeping, comprehensive new law writing the entire legal framework governing naval procurement. Instead, it does something narrower, and honestly, something considerably more clever if your actual goal is to move quickly without triggering a massive legislative fight. It creates a specific, tightly bounded exception, using authority the president already has. Foreign shipbuilders, but only ones actively investing in U.S. yards, can build up to 2 vessels overseas and export them here. 2, not an open floodgate thrown wide, a crack. A very specific, very deliberate, very carefully sized crack in a wall that has stood, largely unchallenged, for the better part of a century. Okay, so now that you have the full sequence laid out end to end, let's actually dig into why this matters, because I want to walk you through 3 different ways of reading what just happened here, and I want to be genuinely fair to each one before I tell you which reading I think actually holds up best against the evidence we've got in front of us. Theory 1, the simplest possible read. This is just industrial pragmatism, full stop, nothing more mysterious underneath it. The U.S. Navy is, by every available metric anyone's put in front of Congress, sitting in a genuine shipbuilding crisis. There's a 2025 Congressional Budget Office report that says it flat out, in black and white, no hedging, it is virtually impossible, using American shipyards alone, to meet the Navy's own stated shipbuilding plan, which calls for an average of 12 ships a year. Not 12 nuclear submarines specifically, 12 ships total across every category, and American yards, structurally, physically, in terms of raw workforce numbers and available dry dock capacity, simply cannot hit that number on their own right now. Meanwhile, South Korea in 2024 ranked second in the entire world in new ship order market share, holding 17%, trailing only China's dominant 71%. Korean shipyards combined can produce over 220 vessels a year across their whole industry. So under Theory 1, this memo isn't some grand strategic gambit dressed up in flag-waving language. It's triage. It's the Navy looking honestly at a math problem it genuinely cannot solve using domestic capacity alone, and reaching for the next best available option. One that also happens to be a formal treaty ally rather than a rival. I want to give that theory its full honest due because it genuinely isn't wrong, it's just, I'd argue, incomplete on its own, and here's the specific question that pushes me past it toward something more. If this were purely, exclusively a capacity fix, driven entirely by the raw numbers in that CBO report, why the specific up to 2 vessels cap and nothing higher? If the actual problem is we structurally cannot build enough ships domestically, the pragmatic solution should scale roughly with the actual size of that shortfall. 2 ships doesn't meaningfully dent a shipbuilding gap that's being measured in these same reports in the dozens of vessels per year. 2 ships isn't a real capacity solution at that scale. 2 ships is a pilot program, and pilot programs, by their very nature, aren't really designed to solve the current, immediate problem in front of you. They're designed to test carefully and safely whether you can solve much bigger future problems the same general way without anything breaking badly on the very first attempt. Which brings us directly to Theory 2. This is quid pro quo, plain and simple, the naval industrial version of a trade concession being paid out on schedule. Under this reading, South Korea didn't earn this specific memo purely through raw shipbuilding merit or superior industrial efficiency alone. It bought it through the 3 $150 billion investment package, through the $150 billion specifically rooted directly into American shipbuilding revitalization, through Korean Air's commitment to purchase over 100 Boeing aircraft worth $36.2 billion, through tariff concessions that brought Korean auto tariffs down from 25% all the way to 15%. This memo under Theory 2 is simply the next scheduled installment being paid out on a much larger deal that was fundamentally struck as an economic and trade negotiation from the very beginning, and is only being dressed up after the fact in the language of naval strategy and alliance cooperation. And there's real, tangible evidence supporting this particular read. The timeline lines up almost too cleanly to be coincidental. Trade deal announced in October, submarine announcement delivered in the exact same breath as the broader trade deal, same press event, same day. Frigate comments in June tied directly to press conferences, explicitly framed around the broader alliance relationship, not standalone defense briefings. Every single major naval concession across this entire sequence has landed either attached to or immediately following an economic announcement first, not a standalone defense policy rollout on its own separate track. That's a genuine, observable pattern, and it's a real one worth taking seriously on its own terms. But here's where I think we actually need to go one level deeper than either of those first two readings gets you, and this is Theory 3, the one I personally think best explains the full shape of what we're watching unfold here. And I want to be completely upfront with you. This next part is my own interpretation of the pattern, laid out across these months, not something any named official has stated outright in so many words in any transcript I've seen. I think the up to two vessels language is actually the entire story here, and I think nearly everybody covering this has been asking the wrong question. Everyone's been asking, understandably, what does South Korea get out of this? Money, shared technology, national prestige, thousands of jobs for Hanwha specifically. Those are all fair, reasonable questions to ask. But I'd argue the more important question, the one that actually explains why this matters years down the road, is what the United States government just demonstrated about its own institutional flexibility to itself, for the very first time, in a way it can now formally point back to as precedent whenever it wants to move further down this same road. Think for a second about what U.S. naval shipbuilding law has actually represented for most of the last century. It's not just a technical regulation buried in some appropriations bill. It's an assumption baked directly into statute, reinforced repeatedly by union politics, reinforced by an entire strain of national security culture. That American warships get built exclusively on American soil, full stop, no meaningful exceptions, because the alternative was, for generations, considered essentially unthinkable. Not merely impractical or inconvenient, unthinkable. A line nobody crossed, because crossing it was understood to mean something much larger about national sovereignty and industrial self-reliance, something that went well beyond the narrow economics of any single shipbuilding contract in front of you. This memo doesn't erase that line outright, not by any stretch. It puts a very specific, very controlled, very deliberately small door directly into it. Two vessels, one treaty ally, a shipbuilder that already has a $100 million physical foothold sitting on actual U.S. soil, a $5 billion expansion commitment already announced and underway, and a track record, stretching back well over a decade in some respects, of actually maintaining real U.S. Navy vessels already, including, and this specific detail matters more than it might seem at first glance, the USNS Wally Shira, a Navy logistics ship that spent a full 6 months at Hanwha Ocean's Geoj shipyard in South Korea undergoing a complete hull and engine overhaul and came back into active service afterward. That was the first time ever that a Korean company had won a contract to maintain an actual U.S. Navy ship, full stop, and Navy officials, at the time that contract was completed, explicitly and publicly called it the start of, in their own words, further naval industrial collaboration going forward. So when you line all of that up in one continuous sequence, what you actually have in front of you is not one single dramatic decision made in isolation on the morning of August 13th. What you have instead is a multi-year, carefully sequenced softening of a boundary that used to be treated as close to absolute with each individual step along the way remaining small and easily defensible entirely on its own separate terms, culminating in a memo that, on its face, only opens the actual door 2 ships wide. But that memo establishes, as a matter of formal, documented presidential authority, that the door can be opened at all under the right conditions. And once a door has genuinely been opened once, expanding it further later on down the road becomes an administrative decision to make, not a philosophical or cultural one to relitigate from scratch each time. That, I'd argue, is the real change buried in all of this, not the specific 2 ships themselves. The precedent now sitting on the Books, that a category called up to 2 foreign-built naval vessels formally exists within U.S. policy at all. Let me put a slightly finer point on exactly why I think that particular distinction matters as much as it does, because I don't want you to simply take my word for the precedent framing without walking through the actual reasoning behind it. Statutes and formal restrictions in defense and national security policy don't typically get repealed in one single dramatic floor vote, all at once in front of cameras. They get worn down gradually through exceptions, through narrow carve-outs, through limited pilot authorizations, each one deliberately sized to be narrow enough to survive without triggering the kind of major political fight a full, wholesale repeal would inevitably provoke. You've seen this exact pattern play out before over the decades with arms export control regimes. You've seen it with other sensitive technology sharing frameworks across different administrations. The very first exception granted is always, by far, the hardest one to actually get through, both politically and culturally, precisely because it's the one that breaks the underlying taboo in the first place. The second, third, and fourth exceptions that come after it are comparatively far easier to grant, because by that point, the underlying principle has already been conceded once. At that stage, you're simply negotiating scope and scale, not relitigating whether the door should exist at all. And I think that's exactly what the full sequence, running from October 2025 all the way through August 2026, actually shows you when you lay it out end to end rather than treating each headline as a separate, disconnected story. October, sharing sensitive nuclear submarine technology with a formal ally for the very first time outside of the existing AUKUS framework. That's taboo-breaking move number one, arguably the hardest single step in the entire sequence. December, a foreign company's own executive standing publicly on U.S. soil, telling assembled reporters directly that they're ready to build the actual submarine, effectively normalizing the entire idea in public discourse well before the U.S. government had even formally authorized any of it. June, the sitting president himself publicly floating an entire future fleet concept built partly around a foreign shipbuilder's involvement, further normalizing the underlying idea in the public conversation. July, an official U.S. Navy request for information, meaning the government's own internal bureaucracy formally, procedurally engaging with the underlying question of hypothetically, exactly how much could you actually build for us? And then, finally, August, the actual formal authorization itself, small in scope, tightly capped, carefully controlled, but genuinely real and legally binding. Every single one of those individual steps, taken entirely on its own, was easily defensible as just this one specific limited thing, nothing more. Collectively, though, laid end to end the way we've just walked through them, they describe the steady, deliberate sanding down of a boundary that America's defense industrial base had treated as close to sacred for the better part of a full century. Now, I want to be genuinely fair to the pushback here too, because there is real substantive pushback against this whole trajectory, and it's worth taking seriously rather than simply waving it away in the name of a cleaner narrative. The CSIS report specifically covering U.S.-South Korea maritime cooperation flags exactly the kind of tension you'd naturally expect to see here. American labor unions and domestic shipbuilders have entirely legitimate, concrete reasons to resist all of this, because every single ship built in a Korean yard, even one built under a strict two-vessel cap, is a ship that isn't being built by American welders in an American dry dock, drawing an American paycheck at the end of the week. That's not some hypothetical, abstract concern dreamed up by protectionist critics. It's exactly, precisely the kind of domestic political friction point that this entire policy shift was always going to generate the moment it became public, and it's exactly the kind of friction that either successfully kills any further expansion of this exception down the road, or if the administration manages to navigate it carefully, becomes the working template for how you manage that same friction the next time you want to widen the door even further. And there's a second separate layer of pushback worth naming just as honestly here. The nuclear submarine piece of this story specifically has its own separate set of skeptics, people who point out correctly that actually building a genuine nuclear submarine-capable shipyard, starting from what is fundamentally a commercial shipbuilding facility, even backed by a $5 billion investment commitment, even with an experienced foreign industrial partner involved, is simply not a project that comes together in a matter of months. It's a project that realistically plays out over years, arguably over a decade or considerably more, and some reporting circulating right around the time of that original October announcement flagged, quite bluntly and directly, that the facility as it physically existed at that moment simply lacked the actual technical capability to do what Trump was publicly describing that day, meaning the announcement itself was, in a very real, measurable sense, running well ahead of the physical reality on the ground at the actual shipyard. So it's genuinely worth separating out, clearly and carefully, the nuclear submarine technology sharing piece of this story, which is extraordinary in its own right, but realistically years away from actually bearing any fruit, from the August 13th memorandum specifically, which is considerably narrower in scope, far more immediately actionable in practice, and arguably more significant precisely because it doesn't require an entire decade of new shipyard construction to actually matter in the near term. It just requires South Korea building ships the exact way South Korea already knows perfectly well. How to build ships at yards that already fully exist today, and then shipping the finished product across the Pacific. So here's where I personally land, having walked all the way through each of these three readings in turn. I don't think Theory 1 is wrong, not even slightly. The underlying capacity crisis is entirely real. The CBO said so in plain black and white language. 12 ships a year simply isn't achievable using the current American industrial base alone right now. That's not political spin. That's straightforward arithmetic sitting in an official government report. I don't think Theory 2 is wrong either. This absolutely unambiguously sits inside